Hey, I have tried troubleshooting this a couple of times on a couple different computers, and I cannot seem to get the camera function to work for any of my presentations. So I think the audio is going to work on this. If you need the camera feature, then just let me know and I can try to figure something else out. For my last course, I did a lot of, because I also struggled with the webcam for my district issued computers. It may be a privacy issue. I did some recording on my phone while presenting on the TV, to try to marry the two together and give a more presentation style. Anyways, okay, so this is, without further ado, my presentation of the backwards design. And yeah, here we go. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. We really appreciate everything that you do for our campus, and I've just got a short presentation for you today on what I feel like is one of the most important curriculum planning frameworks that we can implement on our campus, and that is the curriculum planning of backward design. And so today, the presentation that I'll be giving to you is to understand that design, this backward design professional development, and this is based on some studies and some things that have been done from from educators that are influential within our profession, and that would be Grant Wiggins and Jay McTeague, a framework of designing this curriculum that starts with the end in mind. So as instructional leaders and classroom teachers, our goal isn't simply to just get through the curriculum. Our goal is to ensure that every lesson that we teach intentionally moves the students forward towards mastering those TEKs that are set for your course. By the end of today's session, I hope that you'll all have an understanding of why backwards design helps us become more intentional in our planning, creates stronger alignment between instruction and assessment, and then ultimately leads to higher student achievement. As we go through today's presentation, I'd like for you to think about your own planning process and ask yourself, where do I usually begin when I'm planning my instruction? We'll also have, at the end of this presentation, a quick exercise in how we might do that for our courses. So, okay, let's talk about why backwards is best. Where do most of us start when we first started teaching and we wanted to plan a lesson? It probably went something like this. We found a fun activity. We looked in a textbook, and then next we created our lesson. So we married the fun activity with some foundational learning that was within the textbook, and then we created that lesson. And then finally, at the end of the unit, we made a test. Pretty basic, pretty standard. But I think the problem with that approach is that we're hoping that students learn instead of, or the problem with that approach is that we're just hoping that students learn instead of intentionally designing the learning that best fits our classroom. The backwards design or the backwards learning flips that process on its head. Instead of asking what activities I should do, we ask, what should students absolutely need to know or be able to do based on the TEKs that we have in our course? Once we've answered that question, we determine how students will demonstrate their mastery. Only then will we decide what instruction that we prepare for that success. So effective curriculum design requires that fundamental shift of we want to think about our desired results first. Much like a roadmap, you have your end destination in mind. How we get there can vary a little bit and look a little different, and that's what we want to get the end goal in mind, and we want to figure out how can we get there most effectively. The traditional design might be choosing the major highways first and getting there, but what if there's a wreck on that highway? Do we need to know if there are other alternate routes? Whereas the backwards design, defines that goal and the evidence of that first, and then chooses the method that logically serves those outcomes. So, like you were planning a vacation, most of us don't just get in the car and start driving, very similar to the map example. We decide our destination first, and then we map that route. Sometimes we're going to decide where to stop along the way. If it's something that needs to take a couple of days, if it's something that we feel like we can just get it all done in one trip, teaching works that can work very similarly to that. Our destination is the student learning, and everything else that we do should support getting to that destination. And so we just want to make sure that we are planning it backwards by getting our destination in mind, where we want to go based on the TEKS, or what our desired outcomes are, and then how we get there, we can plan backwards from there. So some of the what I have called the twin sins of traditional design, or what Wiggins and Mateague identified as two patterns of aimless teaching, is the number one: if we just are focusing on activity oriented design, then we could be missing some of that fundamental learning or catered learning to our classroom. Wiggins and Mateague, they describe two common mistakes that educators make. The first one is just having the activity-oriented design. We've all seen lessons where students are busy, engaged, laughing, building, drawing, and participating, and the classroom looks fantastic. But what if I asked, what are students supposed to learn? The answer isn't always clear. Students can be hands-on without being minds-on. The second mistake that they discovered was the second sin, called coverage. This happens when teachers feel pressured to simply just get through the textbook. We'll cover chapter 1, then we'll cover chapter 2, then 3, and before long, you've covered everything, but you don't know if those students have necessarily learned anything deeply. As principals conducting walkthroughs, one of the questions that we should be asking ourselves is this lesson moving students towards a clearly defined learning goal, or are the students just simply completing an activity? This question changes everything. Now, good classroom management can often be disguised as students being on task, but what we need to know is, if the students are just simply busy, like for example, we can have the students busy just watching a movie. Everyone can be on task watching it, even maybe responding to a questionnaire or a prompt of such design. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are actively learning. It just means that they're on task. There's some merit in having things on task, but we want to make sure, you would definitely want that over the alternative, which would just be chaos and nobody's doing anything remotely close to learning. But we would want to make sure that the students are actively learning at the same time. Okay, so if we're looking at the 3 stages of backwards design, we want to make sure that we have identified those desired results first. So what does that actually look like? In stage 1, when we're identifying those desired results, we want to answer some questions. What should students know? What should they understand? What should they be able to do? And we want to be able to clearly define those things, and that can be oftentimes found in the TEKS, and then just based on your own teaching experience and what lessons and what desired learning outcomes have worked for you. Stage 2, we want to determine that acceptable evidence. So how will these students demonstrate the mastery? What assessments will they have to do to show that they've truly learned? This can look like a traditional designed summative assessment, or it can look a little bit more creative with learning stops along the way, just like we talked about, making a desired roadmap towards the learning outcomes that we want. And then finally, we'll move into stage 3, which is plan your learning experiences. So once we've identified the desired results, determined the acceptable evidence, we want to then move forward to planning the learning experiences. Notice that instruction comes last. This doesn't mean that instruction isn't important. It just means that the instruction should always serve the goal rather than becoming the goal. All right, so let's looking forward to stage 1. We want to identify the desired results. We want to answer those key questions like we talked about before. What should the students know? What should they understand? What should they be able to do? What content is really worth understanding, and what enduring understandings are desired. We want to look closely at our district-aligned standards with the TEKS, and everything begins with those standards. As educators in Texas, that means we begin with the TEKS, and our job isn't just to teach every interesting fact about the topic. Our responsibility is helping students master the standards. When unpacking TEKS, teachers should always be asking questions like looking at desired outcomes for learning, what skills should they have to demonstrate, and then what vocabulary is essential as well in understanding the learning outcomes or fully grasping the learning outcomes. What level of rigor does this standard require? Is this going to be a topic that is very difficult to understand, or is it something that's quite a bit easier? Notice that we're prioritizing the learning rather than simply just covering the material that needs to be learned within the TEKS. So we want to clarify these principles and choose what truly matters. As we move on to stage 2, this is where many teachers make a significant shift in thinking. Before we ever plan Monday's lesson, before you ever get on Teacher Pay Teacher, before you ever search Pinterest or look up PowerPoint slides, we need to ask ourselves, how will the students prove their mastery? Our assessment should directly measure that learning target. Sometimes that assessment is a performance task. Sometimes it's a project, sometimes it's an essay, and sometimes it's just a traditional assessment. But the most important thing is that this assessment aligns perfectly with the TEKS and is intended for those learning outcomes and can prove those learning outcomes. As educators, we know we want to prove these learning outcomes because we want to be able to identify whole class shortcomings, individual shortcomings, so that we can then differentiate the lesson to touch on the things that are being missed. But as administrators, when we review these lesson plans, these are one of the first places that we want to look. Can I, as an administrator, clearly see the connection between the standard and the assessment? So we want to think like an assessor. We want to think like that. Decide what evidence will demonstrate that students have truly achieved that desired understanding. So performance tasks, authentic challenges require students to apply knowledge in real-world contexts. We want to see if there are other evidences that we need, quizzes, observations, projects, self-student assessments, or pairing students up to see how they can best find the evidence of the learning outcomes with each other. And then the assessment is no longer just, the shift in thinking of this backwards design versus traditional is assessment is no longer just an afterthought. It's a bridge between your goal and the instruction. And then the activity that you plan is not just the place that you start, but rather the vessel for which you get to your learning outcome or your desired goals. And then finally, we arrive at the actual instruction. So this is the part that I feel like teachers can get hung up on the most, because every teacher wants to have a good, fun, engaging lesson, but we want to make sure that those lessons are stimulating active learning and that we can provide evidence to this knowledge with our final assessments. So once we know where we're going, and once we know how students will demonstrate the success, we can begin planning the learning experiences. This is where the teacher's creativity can really shine. We might use more collaborative learning, think, pair, share. We might do small groups, inquiry. This may or may not include the use of technology. I know that current districts are trying to move away from the use of technology because it seems like in this day and age, we don't need to teach students how to use technology. They all know how to use it. And so it might actually be more beneficial to teach other ways of researching than just using technology. We can set up different stations around the classroom if we have an active lesson that gets the kids moving around and gets them moving from station to station as they are working through the lesson. We can do some hands-on activity if it needs to. And then, just like I said, when we're looking at a defined goal and a way to get there, we can also evaluate our classroom and learn what differentiated instruction is needed to reach every single member of the classroom. While this strategy in within itself was not the most important is our goal, is our outcome. What's important about every instructional activity is that it intentionally prepares every student for success in that assessment when it comes to proving the overall learning outcome and the learning goal. Every lesson should answer the question, how does today's learning move students closer to mastering that TEAC standard? If you can't answer that question, then you need to rethink the lesson and figure out how you can move students closer to mastering that standard. So, some other questions that you might ask yourself: what knowledge and skills will students need? What activities do I need to bring to the table to build those capacities? And then what materials and resources best serve the goals and the lessons that I'd like to plan to achieve those goals? So, while a lot of teachers in the past have been so hung up on the lesson, and in traditional curriculum planning, we went lesson first, fun, engaging, without giving necessarily the right thought to the end goal. We go goal first, backwards planning. What activities can we do to bring our students to that goal? Now, I'd like to give you an actual example of what backwards design in action could look like. The example that we're going to give today is a fourth grade ELA class, and the TEAC's there. The TEAC is defined as explain the influence of historical context on the plot of a literary work. So as we look at this fourth grade ELA class, the TEACs ask the students to explain that historical context and how it lines up with the plot of a literary work. So in stage one, students should understand how historical events influence the characters and plot development of the book that we're going through, which in this example is in A Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. In stage two, when we look at the actual evidence piece, so we've clearly defined the goal, we've made sure that the students understand the goal, and we make sure that that goal is aligned with the mastery standard that the TEAC set, we can move on to stage two, which we have to plan what evidence is going to show that we have mastered that goal. So in this, the students will write an analytical essay explaining how the Great Depression, a historical context event, influenced Logan's family in decisions in the novel Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. So after this analytical essay, we can then see if students have the ability to tie historical context to the plot of a literary work. So notice that this assessment requires students to analyze rather than just recall information. And then finally, that can move us to stage three, which is the actual instruction where we plan the activities. So how we might be moving through this novel is we can set up timeline activities. We can help them with primary source analysis to show how they can cite primary sources when it comes to analyzing their historical context. Socratic seminars and guided writing workshops. When we design that instruction, students examine the historical photographs, they analyze those primary sources, they can, like I said, participate in the Socratic seminars and complete those guided writing assignments. Every activity prepares the student for the final assessment. And so we've identified the goal, we've figured out how we can provide evidence of that goal, and then we can plan the lessons on how they can achieve that goal. A sample assessment. So looking at this example that we've given, students respond to an essay prompt using textual evidence. This is important because we're assessing exactly what we wanted students to understand from the beginning. We're not just asking random questions to them. We're not just testing isolated facts. We're asking students to demonstrate understanding. That's the heart of backwards design. As instructional leaders, the alignment is something we should routinely look at when we are leading PLC meetings or when we're observing PLC meetings and the creative planning meetings and the collaborative planning meetings between departments, is we want to make sure that the backwards design and tying the evidence to the goals is something that is being accomplished across the department. And so, again, we have the desired result. We start with the end goal. And then when we figure out what assessment you can use to evidence as evidence for that goal, and all of that aligns with the TEAC standards of what we're trying to accomplish, then and only then can we move to instructional activities, create a timeline for the work, and figure out how we can get to our end goal. So now, like I said, I wanted to turn some things back on you guys. And so I want you to be able to prove how backwards design might best serve your class and your team. So I'd like for everyone to imagine that you are working with your grade level team. Choose one of the TEACs from your content area, and then first ask yourself 4 questions. The first question is, what is the enduring understanding? So what is the thing that needs to be understood no matter what? And what do students really need to know about this lesson or this unit? Second question you should ask yourself is, what evidence would convince you that they have mastered the understanding? You can look at the aligned learning outcomes that are provided in the TEACs, but for you as a teacher, and you can pair those two things together. But what would it take for you to be convinced that your students have mastered that understanding? Third question that we can ask ourselves is, what assessments will you collect that will provide that evidence of the understanding that they have? And then finally, as we move backwards, so we've defined our goal, what is the enduring understanding? What do they really need to understand? Then we've also asked ourselves, how are we going to be convinced that they have mastered this? What assessments will we use? Then you can work with your team on what instructional activities best prepare students for success. So that should be the fourth and final question that you ask yourself. What instructional activity best prepares our students for that success? Notice that, based on traditional curriculum planning, we didn't start with what was the activity that we're going to do first. We started with the destination. That's the big difference. As we begin implementing backwards design across our campus, I would encourage that everyone continue asking these questions during their planning meetings, and that we would strongly align between the standards assessment and instruction, because the more successful our students will become if we do this sort of backwards design. So that's all that we have for today. To wrap up, I'd like to leave you with one final thought. Backwards design isn't about making planning more complicated. It's about making planning more intentional. When we as teachers begin with the end in mind, students experience greater clarity, stronger instruction, and more meaningful learning. As instructional leaders, our responsibility is to support teachers through the planning process, provide good feedback, and encourage collaboration through our planning time, through our PLCs, to ensure that every lesson is aligned with the standards our students are expected to master. I thank everybody for their attention today. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have about backwards design. If we could turn to our team members, start with a TEAC standard, and then define what enduring learning and enduring understanding we need to have. What should students know? Design their assessment, and then plan some key activities to help us get to that assessment. Then we can better implement backwards design in our classroom. Thank you again. Good night.